In September 2009, a 37-year-old fisherman named Elias Ward failed to return from a routine trip off the coast of Alaska. His vessel should have been back by dawn, yet by 4 p.m. the pier was empty, the tide rolling cold and indifferent. Family and neighbors launched searches across the inlet, but they found only fragments: a torn rain jacket, a radio that had gone silent, and a log that ended too neatly. Locals whispered of the inlet's history, where other boats had vanished without sound, as if swallowed by water that kept its own secrets. Years later, relatives still gathered at kitchen tables, pulling records from sealed envelopes and comparing them with Elias's folded map, now brittle and stained by salt. The case remains open, unsolved, and shadowed by stories that refuse to die. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from today. And if you want more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe. The harbor town still woke in gray silence that September morning. Nets hung heavy with dew. Gulls circled slow against low cloud, and the wood of the pier smelled of salt and diesel. Elias Ward moved with the calm rhythm of habit, a man of 37 whose life had been measured in tides more than clocks. His wife, Marion, stood at the kitchen window as he left, watching him fold his worn nautical map into the pocket of his rain jacket before stepping down toward the water. That map had hung on their kitchen wall for years, its creases deep from folding and unfolding, its corners softened by brine. He carried it the way other men carried wallets, a private ledger of sea routes and dangers. Neighbors saw Elias push off around 5 a.m. The engine gave its familiar cough, then settled into a steady thrum. Fog lifted slightly, leaving a pale track across the inlet as he steered toward deeper grounds. By midday, the village bustled with its ordinary tasks: children trailing home from school, fishmongers weighing the morning's catch, radios hissing weather updates about light wind and passing cloud. No storm warnings came through. There was no sense that a routine had broken. When Marion returned from town in the afternoon, Elias's truck still sat by the dock. She placed groceries on the counter, checked the clock, and thought only that he was running late. By 4 p.m., the pier was bare. The sea stretched smooth and soundless, no mast breaking the horizon. She told herself his nets had caught more than usual, that he lingered longer before heading back. Evening came. No radio call, no familiar sound of the boat's motor against the tide. By nightfall, concern became alarm. Jonas Ward, Elias's older brother, walked down to the pier with a flashlight, sweeping the beam across water that gave nothing back. He asked around the tavern, and men shook their heads. No one had seen Elias after he left at dawn. The Coast Guard received the first alert before midnight, and a cutter was sent to sweep the inlet. They logged the conditions: calm seas, low wind, visibility moderate. It was not the kind of night that swallowed a vessel whole. The next morning brought only silence. Jonas searched the shoreline in his own small skiff, following the pattern he and Elias had drawn years ago on that old map. Rocky fingers jutting from the bay, hidden shoals marked with tiny X's. The paper version remained pinned to the kitchen wall, pencil lines forming roots like veins. Marion stared at it as if it held an answer. The faint graphite circle around the inlet darker than the rest. It was Elias's handwriting, a reminder of where he meant to fish that day. Forensic fragments began to filter in. The weather logs noted a mild front passing, but nothing severe enough to overturn a boat. The cutter crew found no debris, no slick of fuel. A record in the Coast Guard file stated only, "Vessel overdue, last confirmed sighting at departure." It was a line as stark and cold as the harbor itself. Relatives began gathering at the Ward house. Coffee mugs crowded the table. Voices dropped low as speculation edged into fear. Some said Elias must have steered too far into the inlet, a place many avoided even in daylight. Stories surfaced of engines failing without cause, of compasses that spun uselessly near its mouth. To others, those tales were no more than excuses, inventions to explain what could not be explained. By the second night, volunteers lined the dock with lanterns, staring out at black water. No light returned. The map still hung inside, its folds catching the dim bulb of the kitchen, paper that seemed to breathe with the draft from the open door. The search grid expanded, helicopters circling with spotlights, radios crackling with coordinates. Each hour without news deepened the weight inside the Ward house. Jonas kept pressing his palm to the wall near the map, as though the lines might guide him toward his brother. Marion sat at the table with her hands folded tight, refusing to move the groceries still waiting in their bags. By the end of the third day, the official report carried a phrase no family wants to hear: "No contact established." It was the language of endings, though the story had only begun. The pier where Elias had last been seen remained empty. The tide lapped against the pilings, carrying no trace, no answer. On the surface, nothing had changed. Underneath, everything had. Only the pier remained, water reflecting the ghost of a map. Jonas Ward refused to sit idle. On the fourth day, before dawn, he pulled on his boots and carried his own small skiff to the harbor. The pier boards were damp and slick, and the lanterns of the search crew still flickered low. He tied off quickly and rowed out, pushing against the gray tide, the cold mist stinging his eyes. He retraced the route Elias had often taken, hugging the jagged shoreline where waves broke into sprays of white. The locals called it routine, but Jonas knew his brother liked testing the deeper edge of the inlet. By mid-morning, word had spread further than the village. Reporters drove in from Anchorage, cameras slung over their shoulders, asking about the fisherman who had gone missing in calm seas. They got the same story. A man vanished, his boat not yet found. Marion answered none of their questions. She sat at her kitchen table, staring at the folded nautical map Elias had left behind. She unfolded it carefully, fingers tracing the faint graphite circle around the haunted inlet. The edges of the map were brittle, salt lines running like veins. It was not just paper. It was the last trace of intent, the last proof of direction. Neighbors brought casseroles, blankets, and silence. In the quiet moments, the rumors grew louder. Some spoke of the inlet like it was cursed. A fisherman named Dale, broad-shouldered and gray-haired, swore he once saw a light vanish into its fog without sound. Another man recalled nets torn apart as if slashed from below, though no sharks swam those waters. "That place takes what it wants," one woman said, her voice steady. "Always has." Jonas ignored them. He carried a shortwave radio on his lap, hoping for static, any sign of Elias's frequency. All he caught was the Coast Guard's search updates. The first formal report had already been filed. It noted the weather at the time of departure: light wind, calm seas, temperature dropping toward the low 40s. The same file marked a curious detail. Elias's onboard radio had sent a final burst of static at 10:03 p.m., then cut off. No voice transmission, no call for help, just silence. That single line in the report unsettled Jonas more than any rumor. Elias was careful. He always carried his radio close, tested it before leaving. To shut off at that exact hour with no distress signal felt like a puzzle with a missing piece. Marion folded the map again and placed it in a drawer, unwilling to let the paper fray further. The edges had grown soft from his hands, and now her own prints smudged over them. She whispered his name once before closing the drawer. The Coast Guard expanded their grid, moving deeper into the inlet despite hesitation from the local crews. Divers went down in the shallow parts, surfacing empty-handed. Planes swept low, windows rattling the homes below. Each day passed with no sight of the vessel. The official search logs noted negative findings, the language clipped, bureaucratic, and unyielding. At night, lanterns still burned on the pier. Children asked questions their parents could not answer. Some villagers began to pray louder, convinced the inlet had claimed another soul. Marion's house filled with family, yet the air was thin. Jonas brought the map out again, spreading it on the table beneath a weak bulb. He ran his finger along Elias's penciled route, stopping at the inlet's mouth. "Here," he said quietly, though no one replied. "This is where we'll find him." Marion's eyes stayed fixed on the paper. The graphite circle seemed darker than before, as though the sea itself had pressed its mark into the map. The drawer closed once more, but the silence of the house carried its own weight. Outside, the tide pulled steady, as if marking time in a language no one could translate. On the torn map, the penciled route ended at the haunted inlet. By the end of the first week, the inlet became a name carried on every tongue. The village, normally a place where routine carried fishermen from dawn to dusk, had become a stage for whispers. The Ward family heard them most of all. Jonas walked with his head down through the store, listening to the fragments slip between shelves. Engines die there. Lights vanish in the fog. No one comes back whole. The stories, once scattered like folklore, now pointed like arrows toward Elias's disappearance. Jonas was not a man given to belief. He remembered his father's words, "Charts do not lie, compasses do not dream." Yet here he was, caught between the ledger of search reports and the superstition of a town that seemed content to accept myth over proof. One night, a fellow fisherman named Clyde knocked on the Ward door. He smelled of diesel and rain, his face lined with fatigue. "I was out there that night," he said, lowering his voice. "I heard something, a call maybe, or a cry. It carried on the water." Marion stiffened, clutching the edge of the counter. "You're sure it wasn't a gull?" Jonas asked. Clyde shook his head slowly. "No gull sounds like that. It was a man, then it was gone." The Ward kitchen grew heavier after he left. Marion placed her hand on the drawer where the folded map rested. She did not open it, but her knuckles pressed against the wood as if willing the paper inside to answer. 2 days later, a fragment of evidence surfaced. The coastal radar logs, buried in the Coast Guard's files, recorded something more than silence. At 11:45 p.m., hours after Elias was last seen, a faint echo appeared on the screen. A blip, then nothing. The file described it as intermittent signal, no vessel ID confirmed. It was the kind of detail most would dismiss, a line on a report that never found a conclusion. But for Jonas, it burned. If Elias's boat had made that blip, then he had been alive, moving, long after they thought him gone. Jonas spread the map across his table that night. The circle Elias had drawn around the inlet stood out like a wound. With a trembling pencil, Jonas marked the radar's coordinates. The graphite circle overlapped his brother's hand, 2 sets of marks pressed into one fragile page. He sat back and stared at the overlap, the way the marks looked like veins bleeding outward. Neighbors continued their rituals. Some avoided the inlet altogether, muttering prayers as they hauled nets from safer waters. Others ventured close, daring the superstition, but never after dark. Children dared each other to whisper Elias's name near the shoreline, then ran when gulls cried overhead. Each rumor seemed to twist tighter around the Ward family's grief. Marion stopped leaving the house. She cooked only what was necessary, her eyes hollow from sleepless nights. She would sit in the kitchen with the map open, tracing Elias's pencil lines with the tip of her finger, always stopping at the inlet. She never spoke while doing it, never explained what she looked for. The official search concluded with a press release. No evidence of foul play, vessel presumed lost, cause undetermined. The phrasing sealed nothing. Instead, it carved space for rumors to thrive. One evening, Jonas joined a group of men at the tavern. The air smelled of fried fish and damp coats. A younger fisherman leaned close, eyes wide, and whispered, "That inlet. My uncle said he saw a mast there once, half submerged. He swore it was gone by morning." Another chimed in, "Compasses spin. Always have. Don't need proof when every man in town says the same." Jonas slammed his glass on the table. "Proof is all that matters." But his voice faltered, and the men only shook their heads. He walked home through rain. The harbor lights blurred in the downpour. The sea roared louder than his own steps. When he opened the door, Marion was still at the table, the map spread before her. Candlelight flickered against its creases, making the graphite shimmer like wet ink. "I keep seeing him," she whispered. "Right here." Her finger rested on the inlet, where Jonas had drawn his circle over Elias's. Forensic records could not explain voices on the water, nor blips on a screen. Yet here they were, caught between 2 truths, the cold data of reports and the rumors that grew sharper each day. The inlet lay beyond their windows, silent and dark, as if holding something neither would name. The red circle bled across the map like veins on wet paper. The inlet gave back its first offering on the 12th day. A small Coast Guard boat drifted toward the pier with something draped over its railing. A rain jacket torn at the seams, soaked and heavy, the color dulled to a bruised green. Marion stepped forward before anyone else could move. She knew it immediately. Elias had worn that jacket for years, its cuffs frayed where rope had rubbed. The officials laid it on a table inside the station, careful, clinical. The tag inside matched the brand Elias favored, though they warned her such jackets were common among fishermen. Salt had eaten through parts of the lining. Fibers dangled loose, fraying under the fluorescent light. The officer scribbled notes. Condition compromised. No DNA viable. Item logged for record. The words sounded colder than the water that had delivered it. Marion touched the fabric with 2 fingers. It was rough, stiffer than it should have been. She turned the pocket inside out and found a small scrap of paper, soaked to translucence, clinging to the lining. Only faint pencil marks remained, curved like lines of a chart. She recognized them. The same strokes Elias always drew on his nautical map. Jonas hovered near, jaw tight. "Where did you find it?" he asked. The officer pointed toward the mouth of the inlet. The tide had carried it to a cove lined with jagged rocks. The family brought the jacket home. Marion laid it on the kitchen table beside the folded map. The 2 artifacts facing each other like pieces of a puzzle. The paper fragment inside the pocket had nearly dissolved, leaving only a shadow of graphite. But it pressed into her mind more sharply than any intact record. Neighbors came by with condolences, but also with their own interpretations. Some said the sea had given back proof that Elias had drowned. Others whispered that the jacket's condition suggested it had been torn, not worn down. In every version, the inlet was central, a place that kept or discarded as it pleased. Jonas refused to believe the jacket marked an end. He borrowed a skiff and rowed toward the coordinates the Coast Guard had given. The cove was bleak, black rock rising like teeth. Waves hissed against the stone. He held the soaked map on his lap, using it as a guide. The graphite circle Elias had drawn long ago overlapped with the spot. Jonas stared until the lines blurred. He searched the shoreline for hours, but nothing more appeared. No fragments of net, no planks, no flesh. The tide remained steady, unbothered by his presence. When he returned, Marion was bent over the map again. This time, she had placed the jacket fragment on top, the damp paper leaching faint stains into the chart. The effect was eerie. The penciled lines of the map seemed to melt into the water stains. She did not move it. A week later, another small item surfaced. A fisherman hauling traps near the same cove found a plastic container, cracked but sealed enough to hold its contents. Part of a folded sheet, damp but legible. It was Elias's map, or at least one copy of it. The paper was swollen, the creases deepened by water, but the graphite circle around the inlet remained visible. The container passed from hand to hand until it reached the Ward house. Marion laid it next to the first map, comparing them. The same hand had drawn both, but the water damage had shifted the ink, blurring the pencil strokes into gray smudges. It looked as though the sea itself had tried to erase his mark. The Coast Guard logged this too, noting possible duplication of personal navigational record. No analysis followed. It was filed, another line in a folder already thick with loose ends. For Jonas, the maps became more than paper. They were the only language Elias had left them. Each crease was a word, each mark a sentence. He traced them until his fingers were dark with graphite dust. At night, he dreamed of waves breaking over circles of ink, swallowing them whole. The villagers' stories grew louder. Men claimed the inlet had been swallowing ships since the 1930s. An old woman said she remembered 3 boys lost to its waters, their boat found empty days later. A younger fisherman refused to sail past it, saying he had seen lights flicker on the water like lanterns. The Ward family listened in silence, unable to dismiss the voices yet unwilling to accept them. Marion placed the maps and the jacket into a wooden box. She closed the lid and pressed her palm against it, as if sealing the inlet itself inside. Jonas watched but said nothing. He knew the box would not stay closed forever. At night, the house settled into silence. Outside, the waves pressed against the shore with steady rhythm. Inside, the box sat under the table, holding fabric, paper, and stains. Objects that were less answers than questions. On the 12th night, Jonas woke from restless sleep and went to the kitchen. He opened the box. The smell of salt rose up. He unfolded the damaged map, the paper trembling in his hands. The water stains had spread, eating at the graphite until the roots seemed to vanish into nothing. He stared at the place where the line ended, at the inlet's mouth, and whispered his brother's name. The map dissolved, its root bleeding into salt and shadow. By early October, the inlet's reputation had swollen into something larger than the search itself. The fishermen still worked their lines, but they gave the mouth of that bay a wide berth. Nets that once stretched across its edge now sagged in other waters, safer, quieter. The Ward family, meanwhile, found themselves caught between folklore and fact. Jonas spent his evenings in the local archive, a small room above the town hall where damp crept into the wood. He leafed through yellowing newspapers and Coast Guard bulletins. 2 reports caught his eye. In 1997, a trawler named Ruth Ann failed to return, last seen heading toward the same inlet. In 2002, a crab boat vanished with 3 men aboard. In both cases, no wreckage had been recovered. The reports ended with the same bureaucratic phrase Elias's did: presumed lost, cause undetermined. Jonas copied the coordinates into a notebook. When he returned home, Marion was already seated at the kitchen table with the wooden box open. The jacket lay folded neatly inside. Beside it, the second water-damaged map rested in plastic, preserved like a relic. Marion barely looked up. 2 more boats, Jonas said. Same spot. Marion's lips pressed together. Then maybe it isn't just him. He wanted to argue, but the words failed. Instead, he spread his notes on the table. The maps, Elias's originals, the water-stained copy, were placed side by side. The overlapping circles on each aligned too closely to dismiss. The neighbors continued their visits. Some brought food, others stories. One old man claimed his father had once warned never to fish the inlet after dusk. Another said the Navy had tested sonar there in the 1960s and pulled back without explanation. None of them offered evidence, but the certainty in their voices pressed hard against the Ward family's silence. Jonas pushed deeper. He filed a request for Coast Guard records, hoping to unearth more than the clipped reports. Marion, weary of official silence, turned to the church, lighting candles each evening. She kept Elias's wedding band on her finger, though the salt had dulled its shine. One night, Marion opened the wooden box and laid the map flat beneath the kitchen lamp. She traced her finger along the graphite lines. The paper was stiff, its surface ridged with pencil grooves. She paused at the inlet's circle and whispered, "Why here, Elias?" Jonas stood in the doorway, listening but not intruding. A week later, a fisherman delivered another fragment of history. He handed Jonas a torn notebook page, browned by time, that he said had belonged to his uncle, lost in the 1970s. The page described lights on the water, swinging like lanterns, and ended abruptly mid-sentence. Jonas compared the handwriting with Elias's, then folded it into his notes. Forensic files did little to soothe the family. The Coast Guard, under pressure from the community, had compiled a list of missing vessels from the past 50 years. Several clustered around the inlet. The document, photocopied and faint, sat now in the Ward kitchen. Its columns, dates, names, coordinates, were as stark as gravestones. Marion stared at the list until tears blurred the ink. "It's not just stories," she said. "It's all here." Jonas nodded, but he knew a list was not proof. Without a body, without a vessel, the officials would never call it anything but undetermined. Still, the pattern gnawed at him. The recurring symbol, the map, had become more than paper. It was a battlefield where belief and fact collided. To Marion, it was Elias's voice, preserved in graphite. To Jonas, it was data, evidence of something hidden beneath the waves. Each crease told a story, and together they seemed to insist on meaning. On the 20th day after Elias vanished, Marion placed the map and jacket back into the wooden box. She locked it with a small brass key and set it beneath the bed. "No more tonight," she said. "It's eating us alive." But the sea refused silence. The tide struck the shore harder, and winds howled against the windows. Each night, the Ward house felt smaller, the inlet larger. Jonas returned to the archive. This time, he found an old logbook from a lighthouse keeper dated 1938. One entry read, "Fog heavy. Heard a horn 3 times from inlet. No vessel sighted. Marked strange glow on water." The handwriting trembled with haste. Jonas copied the line and brought it home. Marion read it once, then closed her eyes. It never ends. Jonas placed the copied entry beside the maps. The kitchen table looked like an altar, stacked with fragments of paper, stains, and silence. The inlet remained only a shape on paper, yet it grew heavier each day. The Ward family sat together in the dim light, knowing they held more stories than answers. The wooden box locked, but the sea kept knocking. 3 weeks had passed since Elias vanished. By now, most families in the village had returned to routine. Nets checked at dawn. Fish laid on ice. Boats hauled for repair. But the Ward house remained fixed in suspension, as though time had stopped on the morning Elias left. Marion still cooked meals for 2. Jonas still walked to the pier each evening, scanning the horizon long after the sun had slipped behind gray water. The Coast Guard issued its final statement. "Active search concluded. Case remains open." It was a sentence that sounded both official and hollow. For Marion, the words struck like a burial without a body. For Jonas, it meant another kind of battle was beginning. He spread the maps once more across the kitchen table. The water stains had grown brittle, curling the paper's edges. He placed a magnifying glass over the graphite circle Elias had drawn, studying every crease. "He wouldn't have gone this far," Jonas muttered. Not without reason. Marion sat across from him, arms folded. Her eyes were red, her voice flat. "Maybe he didn't go. Maybe something took him there." She reached for the wooden box, unlocking it with the small brass key. From inside, she lifted the torn rain jacket, now stiff with dried salt. She laid it beside the maps, the sleeve falling across the penciled route like a shadow. That evening, the family gathered. Cousins, uncles, neighbors. The Ward kitchen, small and dim, swelled with bodies. Jonas unfolded the maps on the table as though presenting evidence. He pointed to the overlapping circles, then to the coordinates logged in Coast Guard files. The room grew quiet. Some leaned in closer, others looked away. Marion's hands trembled as she poured coffee into chipped mugs. The relatives debated. One cousin suggested Elias might have drifted south, carried by an unexpected current. An uncle insisted the inlet had a pull of its own, that he'd lost 2 nets there in his youth. Every argument circled back to the same point, the inlet as the last place Elias had marked. Jonas pushed the evidence forward. "Look at the logs," he said, tapping a photocopied page. "Fuel records show his tank was still half full. If the boat sank, there'd be a slick. They found none." His voice grew sharp. "He didn't just disappear. Something doesn't add up." The family fell silent. The only sound was the ticking of the kitchen clock, each second grinding against the stillness. Marion folded the jacket back into the box, then closed the lid. "We can argue forever," she said softly, "but the sea doesn't give back answers." Yet Jonas could not stop. He reopened the drawer, pulled out another folder of Coast Guard documents. Inside was a note. "Last GPS ping recorded at 1:07 a.m. Route still aligned with Inlet." He placed it next to the map, his finger pressing hard against the paper. "This means he was alive." Hours later, Marion shook her head. Alive, or his boat was drifting. The relatives dispersed after midnight, leaving the house heavy with unspoken words. Jonas sat alone at the table. The maps lay spread, the jacket half visible from the box. He stared at the graphite marks until his eyes blurred. When he finally rose, he folded the map along Elias's original creases, the paper crackling like brittle bone. In the days that followed, the family fractured quietly. Marion turned inward, attending church more often, lighting candles in rows that flickered against stained glass. Jonas, restless, took his skiff out daily, rowing toward the inlet despite warnings. The water there was calm, too calm, as if hiding something beneath its smooth skin. One afternoon, as clouds hung low, Jonas set his skiff near the inlet's mouth. He unfolded a copy of the map, waited by a stone, and studied the penciled circle. The water beneath him was black, depthless. He lowered a weighted line, counting seconds until it struck bottom. It never did. The rope spun out until it reached its end, still without resistance. Back on shore, he recorded the numbers in his notebook, pressing hard with his pencil. Marion looked at the page when he returned. "So it's deep," she said flatly. "We already knew that." Jonas closed the notebook. He didn't reply, but the silence between them widened. That night, Marion unlocked the wooden box once more. She touched the jacket sleeve, then the folded map. "We're chasing ghosts," she whispered. The brass key turned again, sealing the box. Jonas stayed awake, staring at the ceiling. He replayed the radar blip, the GPS ping, the fuel record, fragments of fact scattered against a tide of superstition. He thought of Elias folding his map that last morning, slipping it into his jacket pocket, as though the paper alone could keep him safe. The house groaned in the wind. Outside, the inlet lay unseen, its surface flat and unbroken, as if nothing had ever passed through it at all. The penciled lines pressed deeper, grooves carved into silence itself. Winter edged in before anyone realized how much time had slipped past. Frost rimed the windows of the Ward house, and the harbor filled each morning with breath clouds from men preparing nets. Still, no trace of Elias's vessel had been found. The Coast Guard had moved on to other emergencies, but the Ward family remained tethered to the same inlet, the same unanswered coordinates. Then, 6 months after the disappearance, a call came from a fishing crew working miles down the coast. They had spotted a small vessel drifting, wedged against a sandbar. The hull number matched Elias's boat. Jonas and Marion drove out together, the gravel roads slick with ice. When they reached the cove, the vessel looked wrong. The paint was blistered from salt, nets collapsed in a heap, and the cabin door swung open as though inviting them in. But there was no body, no sign of struggle, just a silence so deep it seemed staged. Marion stepped aboard first. The deck creaked beneath her boots. Inside the cabin, dust and salt crusted the windows. On the small table, half hidden under a coil of rope, lay a folded sheet of paper. Jonas lifted it carefully. It was another map, Elias's own, the pencil lines blurred but recognizable. The graphite circle around the inlet was darker here, as though traced more than once. The Coast Guard cataloged the boat, but their report was bare. Vessel recovered, condition degraded, no remains located, personal effects, 1 map. They added it to the case file, 1 more fragment without conclusion. Jonas studied the boat's GPS log, scrolling through the entries with tense fingers. The last confirmed coordinates showed activity long after Elias's departure. At 4 p.m. the following day, nearly 24 hours after the initial alert, the system recorded movement. Someone, or something, had powered the boat. The Coast Guard chalked it up to drift, currents carrying the vessel further down the coast. But Jonas wasn't satisfied. The coordinates matched too closely with the inlet's mouth, as if the boat had lingered there. Marion found herself staring at the recovered map late into the night. Its creases were deep, the corners stained. She noticed something Jonas hadn't, a faint smudge, not graphite, but oil, as though a thumb had pressed there after the map had already been waterlogged. The mark didn't match Elias's habits. He had always folded with clean hands, meticulous. This felt like someone else had touched it. The discovery spread quickly through the village. Some claimed the inlet had released the boat deliberately, discarding the vessel while keeping the man. Others whispered of lights seen again, glimmering across the water near the time the boat must have drifted free. Rumors multiplied faster than facts. Jonas called the family together once more. In the Ward kitchen, he laid out the map side by side. The original from their wall, the water-damaged copy from the plastic container, and now the one retrieved from the cabin. Each showed the same circle, but the last bore that faint oil smudge. He tapped it with his finger. "This is the only thing we have," he said. "This mark doesn't belong. Someone else unfolded this after Elias was gone." The room was quiet. A cousin asked if he thought another fisherman had found the boat and left it adrift. Jonas shook his head. "No one in this town would abandon a vessel. Not like this." Marion said nothing. She placed her hand on the edge of the table, fingertips brushing the paper. Her eyes stayed on the circle, the same graphite ring that had haunted them for months. That night, she dreamed of Elias's hands folding the map, slipping it into his jacket, then unfolding it again under a lantern's glow. But when she woke, the image had shifted. It was someone else's hands, rougher, unfamiliar. The Coast Guard closed their report with another clipped phrase. No closure at this time. Jonas and Marion stood together on the pier the next evening, watching the inlet in silence. The recovered boat had been hauled away for storage, but its ghost remained in the air. Jonas held his notebook, pages filled with copied coordinates, sonar depths, and fragments of testimony. Marion held the brass key to the wooden box, her thumb pressed against its cold surface. The tide moved in, unhurried, inevitable. The inlet lay beyond, a mouth that had swallowed boats for decades and returned only what it chose. Neither spoke. The evidence said one thing, the stories another, and in between lay the circle on the map, darker than all the rest. The abandoned boat rocked gently, its cabin empty of answers. By spring, the inlet had become more myth than geography. Children whispered about it in the schoolyard, daring each other to say its name aloud. The older fishermen crossed themselves as they passed, their eyes fixed on the horizon. The Ward family, caught in the middle, bore the weight of both silence and rumor. Marion stopped attending gatherings. She tired of hearing the same lines. The sea wanted him. It's the inlet's toll. Best not to fight what you can't see. She stayed at home, opening the wooden box each evening. Inside lay the jacket, the maps, and a stack of photocopied reports. She touched them the way other widows touched headstones. Jonas, restless, pursued the matter differently. He visited Anchorage to meet with a retired Coast Guard officer who had once overseen searches along the coast. The man's hands shook as he poured coffee. "We logged more disappearances in that stretch than anywhere else in the district," he admitted. "But headquarters didn't want patterns. They wanted closure." He slid a photocopied sheet across the table. Unofficial notes of anomalous radio static repeating every 30 seconds recorded at 2:15 a.m. on the night Elias vanished. Jonas carried the page home like contraband. He showed Marion under the kitchen lamp, the graphite circles on the map reflecting faintly beneath the bulb. "See?" Jonas said. "There was something transmitting after midnight. It wasn't drift." Marion stared at the page but shook her head. Or it was the sea echoing itself. Do you ever think it's worse to know? Meanwhile, the village crafted its own truths. Some swore they saw Elias's silhouette standing on his boat at dawn, nets hanging from his hands, only for the vision to fade in fog. Others claimed lights appeared across the water on nights of the full moon, swinging like lanterns. The inlet became both shrine and warning. One evening, Jonas organized a family council in the kitchen. The table groaned under the weight of evidence. 3 maps, the radar log, the static report, the torn jacket. He spread them as though laying out cards. "This is all we have," he said, "but together, it's more than myth." A cousin pointed at the cabin map. "This smudge here, what if it's from someone boarding after him?" Another relative muttered, "Or it's just grease, nothing more." Marion remained silent. Her eyes stayed fixed on the circle Elias had drawn months before. Forensic photographs arrived weeks later. The Coast Guard had processed the cabin, lifting prints where possible. Among them was one partial thumbprint that didn't match Elias's records. They filed it as inconclusive. Jonas clung to it as proof. Marion tucked the report into the wooden box without comment. By June, the rumors reached fever pitch. One fisherman claimed he'd seen a second boat vanish near the inlet, leaving only ripples. Another swore his compass spun wildly as he crossed its mouth. Journalists arrived again, scribbling notes, chasing angles. The Ward family turned them away, but the stories spread regardless. Late one night, Jonas returned to the harbor alone. He rowed into the inlet with a lantern and Elias's map on his lap. The water was calm, unnaturally so. He stopped rowing, letting the tide hold him in place. The lantern flame trembled, casting shadows across the creases of the map. He thought he heard something, a low hum, too steady to be wind. He leaned closer to the water, but the sound slipped away. When he returned, his face was pale. He told Marion nothing, only placed the map back into the wooden box. But his hands shook as he turned the brass key. The map had become heavier than paper. It was now evidence, relic, curse. Each time Marion unfolded it, the graphite circles seemed darker, as though pressed deeper by unseen hands. She began to avoid touching it at all, glancing only from a distance. One night, she dreamed of Elias standing on the pier, jacket damp, map in his hand. But when he unfolded it, the lines led not into the inlet but into blank white space, as if the sea itself had erased the route. The dream left her gasping awake. She unlocked the box, stared at the folded paper inside, then locked it again. The family lived between two truths, one written in reports, another whispered in the tavern. Neither satisfied. Neither answered. Both circled back to the same graphite mark. The map's crease deepened, as if folded by unseen fingers. The years began to stack like driftwood. By 2011, most of the town had stopped asking aloud about Elias. Boats still gave the inlet distance, but his name faded into quiet, spoken only in the Ward kitchen where the wooden box remained. Yet Jonas refused to let the case slide into silence. He filed requests through the Freedom of Information Act, chasing any scraps from the Coast Guard. For months, nothing came. Then, one winter afternoon, a thick envelope arrived in his postbox, pages stamped with heavy black redactions. He carried it home as though it contained breath itself. Marion brewed coffee while Jonas spread the pages across the table. Most lines were struck through, but a few fragments remained. One report mentioned signal repetition consistent with distress transmission recorded at 2:15 a.m., hours after Elias had been declared overdue. Another page described echoed coordinates near inlet mouth, source unresolved. The language was clipped, clinical, yet each phrase drove splinters deeper. Marion traced the black bars with her finger. If they covered it, they know more than they say. Jonas nodded grimly. He lifted the map from the wooden box and placed it beside the pages. The graphite circle overlapped with the redacted coordinates. Two worlds, folk whispers and official records, now intersected in pencil and ink. Family members gathered again that night. Jonas read aloud from the pages, his voice steady. They knew his boat transmitted after midnight. They knew, and they buried it. A cousin muttered that bureaucrats always closed files too soon. Another insisted the inlet wasn't paperwork, but punishment. Marion closed her eyes. Whichever it is, neither brought him back. She lifted the map gently, now sealed in plastic to keep it from further decay. The graphite circle seemed darker than memory, though she knew it was her own eyes changing. Forensic analysis from the FOIA release added little. One sheet referenced no personal effects recovered beyond single map. Another noted fuel estimate indicated vessel capable of sustained operation. Each detail tightened the knot. If the boat still had fuel, why had it drifted empty? Jonas believed the documents were proof the Coast Guard had abandoned the search too soon. Marion saw something else. That even official language bent around the inlet, refusing to call it what it was. Neighbors returned with new stories. One man swore his father had seen shadows moving on the water the night Elias disappeared. Another said his uncle's compass had spun so violently near the inlet he'd smashed it against the deck. Each story arrived like tidewater, pulling truth and rumor into one indistinguishable swell. Jonas countered with paper. He pinned the FOIA pages to the kitchen wall, alongside photocopies of radar logs and fuel estimates. The map hung in the center, taped over a wooden board. The kitchen transformed into something colder than a home, a war room of paper and silence. Marion found herself staring at the wall late into the night. Sometimes she thought she saw the graphite circles shift, deepening in shadow as though responding to the room's breath. She refused to touch it anymore. She left that to Jonas, who handled it with the precision of an archivist, gloved hands and meticulous notes. The wooden box no longer closed. Its lid lay open on the counter, the brass key forgotten. Artifacts piled inside, the jacket sleeve, the FOIA envelope, fragments of rope collected from the recovered boat. It resembled a reliquary, but one that offered no blessing. Relatives stopped visiting as often. The kitchen wall unsettled them. "You're building a shrine," one cousin whispered. Jonas didn't argue. He added another pin to the map. In December, snow pressed heavy against the roof. Jonas sat alone under the dim bulb, reading the FOIA pages again. His pencil hovered over his notebook, then moved. He copied the phrase "signal repetition" in block letters. He circled it 3 times, then drew a line to Elias's graphite circle. The paper looked less like evidence than invocation. Marian entered quietly. She saw the new marks, the wall of pinned documents, the map at its center. "It won't bring him back," she said softly. Jonas didn't answer. His eyes were locked on the circle, as though it might open into the inlet itself. The silence stretched. Outside, the tide moved beneath ice. Inside, paper whispered in the draft. The map gleamed faintly, redactions casting shadows across its lines. By 2015, 6 years had passed, yet the inlet had not loosened its grip on the Ward family. The rest of the town moved with the rhythm of seasons, fishing, repairing, burying, celebrating. But for Jonas and Marian, time stalled around one question. Each year, the inlet swallowed another silence. That summer, a research team from Fairbanks University arrived with sonar equipment. Their grant proposal had cited geological curiosity, but whispers in the village said otherwise. They wanted to test the trench locals swore existed at the inlet's heart. Jonas convinced them to let him join the survey. He packed his notebook, pencils, and the oldest of Elias's maps, folded carefully into a waterproof sleeve. The team launched at dawn, their boat humming against calm water. Sensors dipped, transmitting blue-tinted echoes onto glowing screens. Jonas leaned close, watching as the lines traced the inlet's floor. For long stretches, the sonar showed only shallow undulations, ordinary seabed. Then, without warning, the image plunged into darkness. A sudden drop, too deep for the machine's first setting. The technician adjusted gain, but the trench remained bottomless on the display. Jonas gripped the rail. That's right where he marked. He held up the map, pointing at the graphite circle Elias had drawn years earlier. The overlap chilled him. The lead researcher frowned. Unusual formation, yes, but geological, nothing more. Still, the man snapped photographs of the screen, storing them for his report. Jonas took his own notes, sketching the trench's outline beside the circle on the map. The resemblance was uncanny. 2 voids mirrored across paper and sea. Back in town, Marian waited. When Jonas returned with the sonar printouts, she barely looked at them. Instead, her eyes fixed on the map in his hand, now damp with salt air. "Every time you bring it out, it feels heavier," she said. He laid the sonar photographs beside the map. The jagged black trench mirrored the pencil circle. Fact and belief pressed against each other until neither looked distinct. The researchers left after a week, filing a bland report about unexplored marine depression. Their language offered no comfort, but Jonas kept the photographs, pinning them on the kitchen wall beside the FOI redactions. The map remained at the center, a hub around which paper orbits swirled. Neighbors shook their heads. "You'll never drag truth out of that place," one man told Jonas at the tavern. "The inlet buries what it wants." But Jonas pressed on. He wrote letters to oceanographic institutes, to maritime historians, even to the Navy. Few replied, and those that did offered nothing more than technical explanations. Still, he compiled every phrase, stacking them into folders. Marian grew weary of the paper. She spent more time at the church, her prayers whispered in the glow of votive candles. The brass key never left her pocket, even though the wooden box stayed open on the table now. To her, locking it felt like denial. leaving it open, surrender. One evening, as the tide slapped against the harbor, Jonas and Marion sat in silence at the table. The sonar photographs lay beneath the lamp, the trench yawning black. Between them rested the map, its graphite circle darker than ever. Marion reached out, tracing the crease with her fingertip. "What if this is all it gives us?" Jonas's jaw tightened. "Then we make it enough." Later that night, he carried the map to the pier. Lantern light caught its folds, the paper trembling in the breeze. He stood at the water's edge, staring into the inlet. Behind him, the town slept. Before him, the trench gaped unseen. He pressed the paper flat against the railing, as though aligning two worlds. The wind shifted. For a moment, he thought he heard the faint crackle of radio static, distant and uneven, like an echo from years ago. He held his breath, but the sound faded into waves. When he returned home, Marion was waiting. She closed the wooden box with slow hands, slipped the brass key back into her pocket and whispered, "It's not finished." Neither of them knew if she meant the search, the inlet, or the silence. The sonar print glared black, a mirror of the graphite circle. By 2020, the inlet was no longer spoken of in public. The younger fishermen ignored it, charting safer waters. The elders kept their stories to themselves, eyes hard when questions arose. Only the Ward family carried the weight openly, though even their voices had softened into ritual. Marion had grown gray around the temples. She spent afternoons with her granddaughter, showing her photo albums where Elias appeared younger, smiling, unburdened. When the child asked why her uncle never visited, Marion paused, then pointed at the wooden box on the shelf. "He went to sea," she said, "and the sea never let go." The box remained unlocked now. Inside lay the rain jacket, the FOIA redactions, sonar prints, and at the very top, Elias's maps. Jonas had framed one beneath glass, hanging it on the living room wall. Its creases and graphite marks were preserved like relics. Guests shifted uneasily in their chairs when they noticed it, but Jonas refused to move it. "It belongs where eyes can see," he told Marion. Forensic clarity never arrived. The Coast Guard maintained the file as open, unresolved. Each year, Marion received a letter confirming the case had not been closed, though no new evidence had been added. The words grew thinner with repetition. Jonas continued his notes. He maintained a binder of every artifact, every rumor, every fragment. He logged them like an archivist. Jackets under personal effects, maps under navigational, sonar prints under scientific. His handwriting remained sharp, though his hands shook more now. At night, he sometimes spoke aloud to the empty room. "I'm still looking," he would say, his eyes on the framed map. Marion heard him but never interrupted. She lit candles instead, small flames guttering against the draft. Neighbors began to ask less. The story had aged into background, folded into the town's history. Some children didn't know Elias's name, though they whispered of the inlet as though it had always been cursed. The Ward family bore the silence like another tide, steady and unavoidable. One afternoon, Marion unfolded the jacket sleeve and laid it across the kitchen table. The fabric was stiff, the salt stains permanent. She placed her hand on it, then looked at the framed map. "We live with objects," she said quietly, "not people." Jonas, sitting across from her, nodded but did not answer. A cousin visited from Anchorage, bringing a digital copy of the Coast Guard file. It contained nothing new, just the same clipped reports, the same phrases. No closure, cause undetermined. Still, Jonas scrolled through each page, as though a fresh reading might conjure more. He paused at the fuel estimate again, tapping the line. "Enough for hours," he muttered. "More than enough." The cousin left unsettled. "You can't keep living in that inlet," he said. Jonas only pointed at the map on the wall. "We don't live in it, it lives in us." Marion sat in her chair, granddaughter on her lap, eyes on the framed paper. She thought of Elias's hands folding it, smoothing the creases, tracing roots. Now the same paper hung mute, preserved, untouchable. As evening fell, the house filled with silence once more. The jacket lay folded. The map gleamed under glass, and the box sat open with its contents half hidden. Outside, the inlet lay dark, unchanged, its waters reflecting nothing but the sky. The framed map glimmered, graphite lines frozen beneath glass. The inlet never changed. It waited, unbroken, a mouth of dark water where tide and rumor met. By the present day, more than a decade after Elias Ward's disappearance, the case remained unsolved, filed away in bureaucratic drawers under the same phrase that had haunted the family since the beginning. No closure. Jonas, older now, still walked to the pier each evening. His hair had gone silver, his gait slower, but his eyes stayed fixed on the horizon. He carried the notebook he had filled over the years, its spine cracked, pages thick with copied reports, sonar prints, and handwritten coordinates. At times he opened it beneath the harbor lights, pencil hovering as though expecting another entry to appear on its own. Marion, quieter still, kept the wooden box on the shelf in her living room. The brass key lay beside it, though she no longer used it. Inside, the jacket rested like a husk, the FOIA redactions curling at the edges. Atop them, Elias's maps remained, the originals, the water-stained copy, and the one recovered from the boat's cabin. Their graphite circles had darkened with age, not in ink but in memory. Relatives visited occasionally, asking fewer questions now. The inlet had settled into legend. Younger cousins whispered that Elias still sailed there, lanterns swinging from his mast. Old neighbors warned newcomers never to drop nets near its mouth. Belief had outlasted evidence, yet fragments still arrived. Once, a journalist sent Jonas a photograph of a Coast Guard archive box labeled Unprocessed Alaska Incidents. He wrote back, requesting access, but received no reply. Another time, a fisherman swore he had seen a half-submerged mast vanish into fog. Jonas logged the account, though even he admitted it added little to the ledger. Marion found her solace elsewhere. She lit candles in church, telling her granddaughter that fire held memory better than paper. Sometimes she would sit at the table, eyes on the framed map hanging on the wall. Its creases glinted under glass, a frozen echo of hands that no longer lived. She never touched it. Jonas, however, still sought weight in objects. He took the maps from the box on stormy nights, laying them across the table. He compared graphite lines to radar logs, sonar prints to fuel estimates. He whispered Elias's name under his breath, as if the map might answer. When he grew weary, he folded them back along their old creases, the paper sighing like brittle bone. The Coast Guard sent another letter in 2021. Status unchanged. It was the same language they had used every year. The envelope joined the rest in Marion's drawer, unopened after the first line. The town itself seemed to forget. New buildings rose. Younger fishermen steered different routes. Tourists came and went without knowing the inlet's weight. Only in the Ward home did the silence remain sharp, edged by artifacts no one else wanted to keep. One evening, Jonas sat alone in the kitchen. The wooden box was open, its contents spread before him. The maps, the jacket, the photocopies, all laid flat like exhibits in a courtroom without judge or jury. He touched the graphite circle on one map, pressing until his finger left a smudge. His voice cracked as he said, "I've given you everything I have." Marion stood in the doorway. She didn't ask whom he spoke to. She only stepped forward, closing the box with both hands. "It's over," she whispered, though she knew it wasn't. Not truly, for the inlet still lay beyond their window, unbroken, indifferent. It had swallowed Elias and returned fragments, a jacket, a boat, a map smudged by an unknown hand. It had given no body, no confession, no certainty, only silence, heavier than proof. Years later, when Marion's granddaughter asked about the man in the photographs, Marion pointed again to the framed map. "This is all we have left," she said. The child pressed her palm to the glass, leaving no mark. At night, when the house grew still, the maps seemed to shift in their folds. Graphite lines blurred into shadows, creases deepened like trenches. Whether it was memory, belief, or the sea itself, no one could say. The inlet kept its secret, The case remained unsolved, and the Ward family lived in the space between fact and rumor, holding to paper that had outlasted flesh. The inlet stayed dark, the folded map forever locked in silence.